This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. Obsidian. We here at the Word of the Week never quite know where one of these scripts is going to go when we start writing them. And that's even when we have a really clear idea about how the script should go. For example, as we sat down to write about the history of something ubiquitous, something utterly clear and transparent, things quickly became very murky and muddy. See, we were going to discuss glass, what it is, how it was invented, how it's made, and how it's been used. And we decided to start way back in the Stone Age with a discussion of obsidian, because technically, obsidian was the first glass humans ever made use of. But unlike the glass we're used to, obsidian isn't clear. It's dark, it's mysterious, and it's murky. So if you're looking for clarity and illumination, you'll have to wait for next week. This week we're discussing obsidian. Honestly, it's sort of appropriate to start the discussion of glass with the discussion of obsidian anyway, because as transparent as it is, glass actually blurs some lines in chemistry that should be pretty clear, and obsidian illustrates that perfectly. Obsidian is a naturally occurring mineraloid, and to understand why we have to call it that instead of calling it a mineral, you have to understand something about the difference between solids and liquids. Now you might be saying, one is solid and one is liquid, duh! And you'd be technically correct, even if you were being a bit of a smart aleck. Liquids are things that flow and that take the shape of their containers. Solids are rigid, they don't flow, and they retain their shape. But the reason for those differences originate on a very tiny level, the molecular level. You know, of course, that all substances are made of tiny constituents called atoms that lock together in arrangements called molecules. A water molecule, for example, consists of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom bound tightly together by chemical forces. And an oxygen molecule consists of 2 oxygen atoms bound together. But a bucket of water contains many molecules. How many molecules? Well, obviously that depends on the size of the bucket. But to give you some perspective, let's consider how many molecules there would be in a little over a tablespoon. Okay, 1.2 tablespoons, or 0.6 ounces, or 18 milliliters. In that precise amount of water we chose, there would be 600 sextillion molecules of water. That's a 6 followed by 23 zeros. Now, those numbers are not as arbitrary as they seem. That number, 600 sextillion, or to give the exact mathematical scientific notation, 6.02 multiplied by 100 sextillion, is a special bit of chemistry shorthand called Avogadro's number. But before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about that sextillion thing. Have you ever wondered how to say really big numbers like that? How do you know, for example, when to say million or billion or octillion or septendecillion? There actually is a rule, and it has to do with something called the Latin power. In America, when we write large numbers, we insert commas after every third whole number digit, right? We write 1,000 as 1,000. Well, the number of 0,000s is called the Latin power. The Latin power of 1,000 is 1. There's one set of 0,000 after the 1. Same with the Latin power for 10,000 or 100,000. They all have a Latin power of 1. If we go up to 1,000,000 or 10,000,000 or 100 million, there's 2 sets of 0,000s. That's a Latin power of 2. Got it? Meanwhile, we have this word, million. And million comes from mille, which is Latin for 1,000, which is why a millennium is 1,000 years. The trouble is, when it comes to numbers, we already have a name for 1,000. It's 1,000. So million became the word for 1,000,000. Except technically the word million is a combination of the word million and the letter M from the word mono, meaning 1. Combine mono and million, you get million. 1,000 thousands is 1 million. If we multiply by 1,000 again, so we have 1,000 thousands, we have a billion, which comes from bi meaning 2, and illion meaning thousands of thousands. And 1,000 thousands? We combine tri meaning 3 and illion to get trillion. And then there's quadrillion and quintillion. The name of the power of 10 comes from Latin counting, and it's counting the Latin powers. Or, if you prefer to think of it this way, the number of commas in the number. But it's always counting one less because of that thousands versus millions thing. A billion is a number with 3 commas. Subtract 1 comma and you're left with 2 illions, or bi-illion. And we can go all the way up to a 1 with 10,000 zeros, which has a Latin power of 3,333. That gives it the name Tremilia Trecento Trigintillion. We'll let you work out the Latin. But we digress heavily. Our point was, inasmuch as it can be said that we had one, was that the number 6.0200 sextillion, Avogadro's number, is an extremely famous number in chemistry because it allows chemists who understand how to use it to scale up from the number of atoms or molecules of a substance to the weight of that amount of substance and then to the volume of that substance. And it allows smug podcasts to show off by jumping from an exact number of molecules of something like water to an exact volume of water without a whole lot of math. But we really digress. The point is... Wait, what was the point? Avogadro's number, names of numbers, Latin powers and counting, numbers of molecules and things, liquids and solids. Oh yeah! The point is, the real difference between a liquid and a solid. And this will be super important in a moment as it helps us explain some of the properties and myths about glass. The real difference between a solid and a liquid is the arrangement of molecules. In a liquid, the molecules are mostly free to slosh around each other. It's basically just a molecular soup. But in a solid, the molecules clump together in some sort of regular pattern. And we call that regular pattern a crystal. Crystal, by the way, comes from the Greek word kryos, meaning frost or ice. See, every molecule has a distinct shape, and there are forces that govern how molecules like to sit together. Now, when molecules have a lot of energy, they don't sit still. But when they calm down a bit and cool down, they start to settle into patterns. They clump together in specific arrangements, and those arrangements define the properties of the solid. Now, obsidian is a weird case because it is a solid, but it's the sort of solid that challenges our view of what a solid actually is. Obsidian starts its life as lava, a molten rock. Normally, the lava that forms obsidian would cool slowly. And as it cooled, the various molecules would gradually settle down and lock into place and form crystalline minerals, which would gather into rocks like granite and rhyolite. But if the lava cools too quickly, the molecules don't have time to find their proper places in the crystal before they stop moving. And thus you have a brittle, smooth, glassy substance that comes in blacks, browns, tans, and greens. And because of its irregular internal structure, obsidian tends to fracture along weird curves instead of breaking along corners like most crystals. And those edges can be extremely thin. Razor thin, actually. In the Stone Age, various peoples discovered that obsidian could be broken off easily to produce extremely sharp edges that were useful for knives and cutting tools, and eventually for spear tips and arrowheads. And ancient peoples valued obsidian quite highly. In fact, archaeological evidence indicates the crafting of obsidian may have been one of the first true human industries. Several Neolithic archaeological sites across the Middle East have revealed extensive deposits of obsidian debris, which indicate large numbers of tools may have been manufactured at the same site, a bit like an obsidian tool factory. And evidence based on the chemical composition of various obsidian artifacts also indicates Stone Age trade networks of obsidian. Now, in the Bronze and Iron Ages, obsidian was replaced by metal because even though obsidian held an extremely sharp edge, it was brittle and could snap or shatter. But in the Americas, obsidian remained in use extensively until the 1500s. The most famous example of obsidian use in the pre-Columbian Americas is probably the Aztec sword known as the macahuite. The Aztec sword was a broad, wooden paddle with several obsidian razors embedded around the edge. The Aztecs also used obsidian, or itzli as they called it, in spear tips and arrowheads. And their spears were especially deadly when hurled using an atlatl, or spear thrower. And that brings us around to some other dark and confusing stories that aren't as clear as we like to think they are. In point of fact, the entire history of the various Mesoamerican civilizations is clouded with mystery. The story of Mesoamerican civilization begins somewhere around 5000 BCE, during which hunter-gatherer tribes settled down in the fertile, well-watered coastal areas of the Gulf of Mexico and supplemented the plentiful supply of local food with agriculture, particularly in the form of corn, which they called maize, and beans. The fertile lands along the northern coast of southern Mexico, in the shadows of the Tuxtl Mountains, were bountiful, and the people who settled there enjoyed 2 growing seasons each year. By 1200 BCE, the food surplus allowed the mysterious Olmec civilization to rise and flourish. Now, we know bits and pieces about the Olmecs, but what we know is a bit scattershot. For example, we know that they had complex codified religious practices and that they were amazing architects and sculptors. In fact, they are most famous for their sculpture. We also know that they cultivated cocoa beans and may even have used the beans as a form of currency. They also traded extensively with other city-states and smaller tribes in the region. We don't know, though, what they called themselves. The Aztecs referred to them as the Olmecs, which means the people of rubber, because they grew rubber trees and made rubber from the sap. They even made rubber balls to use in their organized sports. We also don't know what happened to them. See, at their height, the Olmecs had at least 3 great cities and a number of smaller towns and colonies. But in 900 BCE, their primary capital of San Lorenzo appears to have been suddenly and systematically destroyed. The capital was moved to a second city, La Venta. But in 300 BCE, that city too appears to have been deliberately desecrated and destroyed. And without our really knowing why, the Olmec civilization declined and passed into memory. Meanwhile, in the highlands of central Mexico, another civilization was also flourishing. The Zapotec, or Cloud People, were also an agrarian civilization who built many cities in the Huaca and 2 neighboring valleys. Trade between the Olmec and Zapotec people led to some similarities between the cultures, but the Zapotec had their own complex religion. The Zapotec culture was highly sophisticated and made many advancements in art, architecture, engineering, and irrigation systems, many of which were driven by the difficulties farming and constructing in such a rugged terrain. And then, around 250 CE, a new power began to rise along the Yucatan Peninsula, and along the coast of Mexico and into Central America. They comprised 2 ethnic groups, the northern Yucatec and the southern Quiche. But we refer to them by one name derived from their greatest and last capital, the Maya. Mayan civilization was, like the Olmec that came before and the Zapotec that were its contemporaries, heavily urbanized. It was focused on urban centers, and the Maya had numerous major urban centers, including those at Chichen Itza and Uxmal. And while they enjoyed cultural influence from the Olmec and the Zapotec, they had a predominant culture and style all their own. At the center of Mayan culture was the belief in a complex cycle of life. When one died, they believed, that person descended to the underworld of Xibalba, the place of fear, and began a long journey toward Tamoanchan, the place of the misty sky. If one survived the difficult journey across the 9 underworlds of Xibalba, and climbed through the 13 levels of Tamoanchan, they would enjoy everlasting peace in paradise. There were shortcuts, though, Women who died in childbirth, warriors who died in battle, and those who died in sport or killed themselves voluntarily in the name of the gods could all bypass the journey across Xibalba. The Mayan view of the cosmos shaped all aspects of their culture. They were a warrior people and revered war and death in battle. They conducted their religious rites in caves to evoke the darkness of Xibalba and on the tops of high pyramids, which were made in the image of the great mountain of the gods known as Huitzab, and evoked the underworld of Tamuanchin. They regularly engaged in human sacrifice, and their belief in complex cosmological cycles is what led to the creation of their famous calendar, or rather calendars. For regular use, the Mayan had two simultaneous calendars. First was the Hab, the civil calendar. That tracked normal daily life and consisted of 365 days divided between 18 months of 20 days each. The second, which ran alongside the Hab and interlocked with it like a pair of gears, was the Tzolk'in. That calendar had only 260 days, so it would start to repeat before the end of the Hab year. The Tzolk'in tracked sacred days and spiritual events over the short term. But for longer cosmic cycles, the Maya also had the Baktan, or long count calendar. It tracked the current spiritual age, and the beginning and end of the current age coincide with August 11th, 3114 BCE, and December 21st, 2012 CE. If you remember that crazy folderol about the Mayan calendar predicting the end of the world 5 years ago? Yeah, that's where that came from. But the Maya would have found such an idea ridiculous. They didn't really believe in endings at all, just cycles and cycles and cycles. Now what's very interesting is that sometime between 900 and 1000 CE, both the Mayan and Zapotec civilizations went into a sudden decline. This has been misstated as the various civilizations vanishing from the face of the earth, and that's not true at all. But what is true? Well, we're not quite sure. We do know that the Maya suddenly abandoned their greatest cities and their population suddenly decreased. And we know that Zapotec cities show signs of gradual decline and destruction resulting in the same overall effect. A combination of factors is likely to blame. But we do know that the agricultural systems of both Mesoamerican civilizations, along with several others that also appear to have gone into decline, were quite sensitive. Several years of drought, for example, or disastrous volcanic eruptions could decimate those civilizations' food supplies. And we do have evidence of civil unrest in Zapotec cities during the period, and strains due to overpopulation in Mayan centers. Regardless, the great cities of the Zapotec and the Maya were abandoned by those civilizations, and repopulated by members of the Toltec tribe who migrated from the north. From the repopulated urban centers, the Toltecs were briefly able to conquer their own empire, but they couldn't hold it for long. And so, from about 1100 CE through the mid-1300s, Mesoamerica lapsed into a dark age of chaos, anarchy, and war, and the cities of the former great civilizations were truly abandoned. Throughout this period, the small city-states and towns spread over Mesoamerica went into fierce competition for local resources and political power. Over time, however, some of these settlements began to form alliances. And when three of these growing powers came into conflict, those from Texcoco, Tenochtitlan, and Tlacopan, they chose to consolidate their power and form a single army. That army began a massive campaign of territorial expansion in the early 1400s. In short order, the warriors and wealthy nobles of Tenochtitlan came to dominate the alliance. And thus, they came to rule over the Aztec Empire. It is important to note that the Aztec Empire was made up of a number of ethnic groups and descendants of various societies. Dominating the empire was an ethnic group of migrant hunter-gatherers who had traveled from a place they called Aztlan, or the land of white herons, to settle Tenochtitlan. They called themselves the Mexica. Now, the Aztec Empire was remarkably and bloodily successful, and this is due to their warrior culture as well as their advanced weaponry. All adult males were conscripted into the military and were extremely well trained, and elite warriors were well rewarded. Their armies focused on city centers, and on a successful conquest, they claimed all the farmland and smaller settlements around the city. From their conquests, they demanded ongoing tribute, and they would sacrifice prisoners and tributes to their gods. Their hold on conquered lands was strengthened with intermarriages in some cases, and in the appointment of governors from the Aztec heartlands. In many cases, the Aztecs constructed temples and monuments in conquered territories that forced the occupied people to integrate into the Aztec way of life. And of course, above all, their power was maintained with the constant threat of military intervention. And this is, of course, where we discuss just how well equipped the Aztec warriors were. As we mentioned above, their primary weapons included the obsidian-bladed macahuit and their spear-throwing atlatls. The obsidian-edged sword club was a particularly savage weapon. The obsidian blades were sharp enough to sever limbs, and there are even stories of an Aztec warrior beheading a horse with the sword. To protect themselves, the warriors wore padded cotton armor and carried reed or wooden shields covered in animal hide. Elite warriors would also costume themselves in feathered headdresses and animal costumes to signify their membership in elite units as well as their rank. Among the most respected of the elite warrior groups were the eagle and the jaguar. Within a century, the Aztec had gone from control of a single settlement to controlling most of northern and central Mexico, a land area of roughly 50,000 square miles, with a population of roughly 11 million people at its height. And Tenochtitlan, with its 200,000 inhabitants, became the largest city in the history of the pre-Columbian Americas. And they developed a sophisticated, highly religious, and highly stratified culture. So, what happened to the Aztecs? Well, the short answer, and the smug one, is that Spanish conquistadores arrived and conquered the empire. But the long answer is far more complex, and muddled, and confused. Accurate accounts are difficult to come by, and the events surrounding the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire are quite divisive, alternatively painting those involved on both sides as heroes or demons, as treacherous and deceptive, or as trying to avoid outright warfare. It's a complicated, ugly story of two rival militaristic empires meeting for the first time, and each seeking to maintain and expand their power base. And seen in the cold light of the modern age, where expansionist and colonial practices are looked down upon, it's hard to give either empire a fair shake, especially given that, in the end, the Aztecs were the underdogs. See, the Aztec Empire had become increasingly unstable in the short time it had existed. Its neighbors feared it, and its subjugated people, forced to pay tribute and to adopt the Aztec culture, struggled against Aztec rule. Rebellions were frequent, and the Aztec warriors were brutally efficient at putting them down. Meanwhile, the Spaniards of Cuba had become mistakenly aware of the vast wealth of gold and other riches in the Mexican interior. Governor Velázquez de Cuellar of Cuba sent Hernán Cortés to establish contact with the natives of Mexico, though whether they initially sought to trade or to plunder was unclear. At the last minute, the Cuban governor revoked his order and recalled Cortés. But Cortés refused to obey the order and set out anyway. Initial contact between Cortés and the natives seemed peaceful enough. Gifts were traded, but skirmishes also occurred. When Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, the story starts to become muddier. See, the ruler of the Aztecs was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, more commonly Romanized as Montezuma. Now, the empire's instability was putting a strain on Montezuma's power. Further, according to some accounts, Montezuma and the Aztec priests believed that omens had revealed that, by the will of the gods, their empire would fall to a foreign power. Some have interpreted these accounts to mean that Montezuma believed Cortés was a representative of the gods, or perhaps a god himself. Meanwhile, Cortez came to appreciate the military might of the Aztecs and realized his soldiers could not defeat the Aztecs alone. And so, historians cannot be definitive on the actual motives between the initial peaceful contacts between Montezuma and Cortez. Because those initial contacts were peaceful. Gifts were exchanged, tributes were paid. But there were also disagreements. From other records, it appears that both Montezuma and Cortez attempted to leverage rebellious members of the empire against each other. Montezuma apparently promised to reduce tributes or even recognize the freedom of various peoples in return for alliance against the Spanish. Cortez apparently promised freedom to subjugated peoples in return for their support. After a few skirmishes and more than a little posturing, Montezuma agreed to pay ongoing tribute to Cortez. But Montezuma's position in the empire was weakening, and Cortez was technically a fugitive. The Cuban governor sent another soldier, Panfilo de Narvaez, to bring Cortez back. While Cortez went to meet the Spanish forces, he left his lieutenant and his soldiers in Tenochtitlan. Tensions grew between the Aztecs and Spanish soldiers, and those came to a head at an event called the Massacre of the Festival of Tenochtitlan. And when it comes to dark events whose causes are unclear, the Massacre of the Festival of Tenochtitlan is probably the darkest and unclearest of them all. The festival was an annual appeal to the gods to send rain, and it involved, as most Aztec ceremonies did, a number of human sacrifices to the gods. The Spanish soldiers were opposed to the practice. What happens next was unclear. Many accounts tell many different stories. According to some accounts, the Aztecs planned to seize the opportunity to kill the Spanish soldiers and make them sacrifices, and Cortez's lieutenant had heard of the plot. Others suggest that Montezuma lost control of his soldiers, who were planning an uprising on the belief that Montezuma was a Spanish puppet. And still others suggest Cortez's lieutenant saw the opportunity to strike against the Aztec nobility and secure their power by frightening the people into docility with a barbarous act. Whatever the cause, Cortez's lieutenant suddenly ordered the massacre of all Aztec in attendance at the festival and took Montezuma as a prisoner. When Cortez returned from his battle with Narvaez, he found the city in an uproar. When he and Montezuma tried to reassert order, Montezuma was stoned to death, and Cortez and his soldiers were forced to flee the city. A year later, after a short but bloody war, Cortez seized Tenochtitlan, and the reign of the Aztec Empire was ended. Because unfortunately, cotton armor provides little protection from rifles and cannons, and obsidian shatters against steel armor. This has been GM Word of the Week. It's written and researched by The Angry GM and produced by me, Fiddleback. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/GMWordOfTheWeek. You can find more at gmwordoftheweek.com and theangrygm.com.